At a glance, rollers seem like they would be a fairly simple weapon class. Just spawn a bunch of projectiles in an area and you're done, right? Well, you'd be sort of right if you thought this, but it's not quite that simple. Rollers, and by extension brushes, have quite a few unique projectile spawning mechanics ranging from benign, to useful, to detrimental. Welcome back to Projectiles 101, the series where I pick apart and explain the projectile mechanics of the beautiful train wreck that is Splatoon 3. Today's class is rollers and brushes. I'll be delving into both horizontal and vertical swings in this video, alongside brush swings. Safe to say that's going to be a lot of material to go over at once, so grab your pencils and notebooks and possibly some popcorn because we're going to be here for a while. As always, this video will be split into two parts, the first one being an explanation of how the mechanics work, and the second one being a visual demonstration of how the projectiles of every roller and brush look in practice. These visual demonstrations are accurate to version 10.0.1, and should any relevant parameters change in an update, I will leave an updated simulation in the pinned comment below. In addition, I will be leaving any corrections to this video in the same pinned comment, as I am not perfect and prone to mistakes like everyone else, so be sure to check out that comment in case there's any important info in it. Well, enough rolling around the bush. There's a lot to get to, so let's start right now. The first thing you'll need to understand is projectile groups. Projectile groups are a concept that shows up on weapon classes that fire multiple projectiles at once. In essence, rather than spawning each and every projectile under the same set of parameters, we can put the projectiles in different groups and assign parameters to each group individually. This allows us to, for example, assign different spawn speeds to different projectiles in the group so they all come out at different speeds and cover a uniform area. We could also then give them different hitbox sizes so the ones that are far away are larger than the ones up close. When we're working with a ton of projectiles at once, this sort of grouping gives us a large degree of control over how all the projectiles function together. For example, the shape that the Tri-Slosher creates is only possible because of how the projectiles are split into different groups. We could also use these groups to force the projectiles to spawn at different speeds and thus cover a consistent uniform area rather than leaving that up to RNG, in theory at least, but we'll get more into that later. So, every projectile group defines its own set of parameters. Exactly which parameters are defined can vary from class to class, but for rollers, each group defines the following parameters. Number of projectiles fired, how spread out those projectiles are, where exactly they spawn from, how they move, their collision size, and painting power. This list is not exhaustive, but it does get the general gist of it. You'll also notice that damage is not in it. Although there is functionality for each group to define a damage multiplier for itself, in practice this is always set to 1, so it's effectively unused. I'll explain how roller damage is calculated later, but for now understand that damage is not different across different groups. With that out of the way, let's delve into the projectile spawning process for horizontal flicks. I'll walk you through every step of the process with this neat demo. To start, let's assume we have a roller projectile group that spawns 12 projectiles. The number of projectiles that is spawned per group is stored in this parameter. This blue dot that all projectiles are spawning from is what I'll call the group's base spawn point. Different groups can have different base spawn points, which will become more important later, so make sure to keep that in the back of your mind. The arrows represent a projectile, where the bottom of the arrow represents the spawn point, the arrow length represents the velocity, and the direction of the arrow represents the angle in which it travels. Note that I've exaggerated some of these steps along what is normally done in-game to make things a bit more clear. And remember, this is an example of just one group. Rollers can have other groups that have completely different parameters. The first step of the process is to spread out those projectiles by an amount determined by this parameter. In this case, I've decided to spread them out by 30 degrees. Since we spread them out both to the left and the right, this results in a total spread of 60 degrees. The 12 projectiles in the group are then evenly distributed across this spread. If there's only one projectile in the group, it will go straight and ignore this parameter. After this, we then apply a horizontal spawn offset determined by this parameter. In our case, we've chosen an offset of 1 unit, and like with angular spread, this also applies in both directions, for a total spread of 2 units. Note that the angle in which the projectiles spawn at doesn't change, just their positioning. Once again, if there is only one projectile in the group, it will ignore this parameter and spawn in the center. Next up is spawn speed randomization. This is usually the most impactful randomization of the whole process. The spawn speed is calculated by setting a base spawn speed stored in this parameter, then adding or subtracting an amount between 0 and a value stored in this parameter. In our case, the base spawn speed is set to the arbitrary number of 5, and the random spawn speed factor is set to an arbitrary number of 1. Thus, our projectiles can spawn at any speed between 4 and 6, with an even distribution, which looks like this. After spawn speed randomization, there's angular randomization. Angular randomization is applied to every projectile individually, and it works by taking the projectile spawn speed with random spawn speed applied and multiplying it by a value stored in this parameter. It then takes the result and adds the speed to the projectile perpendicularly, resulting in a change of angle like so. In our simulation, I've set this angular randomization factor to 0.2. Here's what it looks like when we apply it. Lastly, we process our final form of randomness, spawn position RNG. After all that we've done so far, the projectiles then have their spawn positions change up a little bit. The game does this by adding or subtracting a random number between 0 and a value stored in this parameter in the X, Y, and Z directions relative to the direction that the player is looking in. You can think of this as the game moving the projectile spawn point randomly within a cube that has side lengths of twice the amount stored in the parameter. In our simulation, I've chosen to set this parameter to 0.2, which is pretty light compared to everything else. Applying it now gets us here. Brushes use similar logic for their swings with 2 little steps added. I've created an example brush group that will use the same parameters as the example horizontal swing group I just went over, but with 5 projectiles instead of 12. Let's speed through the same steps I just went over that are used in horizontal swings. Spawn angle, spawn position spread, random spawn speed, random spawn angle, and random spawn position. Let's talk about the unique brush mechanics now. First, groups can have their projectiles gain a velocity boost similar to how the angular RNG does, but vertically and without randomness. Basically, the speed of the projectile is multiplied against the coefficient stored in this parameter and added to its velocity perpendicularly in the vertical direction, like so. A positive coefficient means it goes up, and a negative one means that it goes down. Here, I've made the coefficient positive, so it goes up. It's usually negative though. If you look up and down, the angle that the extra velocity is applied in changes to match, as, remember, it's applied perpendicular to the initial velocity. The second additional thing that brushes do is they have a horizontal angular offset that gets applied depending on which direction you swing your brush in. If you start swinging from a standstill, you will swing your brush from right to left. I'll call this a left swing. If you continue to mash the ZR button, you'll then swing the brush from left to right. I'll call this a right swing. Going back to a standstill and then swinging will always start with a left swing. What's important about this is that the groups are usually given an angular offset depending on which direction you swing in. Left swings give you a leftwards angular offset, and right swings give you a rightwards angular offset. These offsets are stored in these 2 parameters. Now for vertical swings. Unlike horizontal swings, vertical swings feature no RNG, but there's still a lot that goes into how they work. This time I'll be using 5 projectiles, as vertical swings tend to have far less projectiles than horizontal swings do. Firstly, the angle that the projectiles go at is calculated differently to horizontal swings. Instead of calculating a spread and evenly distributing the projectiles across it, it picks a base spawn angle, stored in this parameter, and makes the first projectile travel at that angle. In our case, that angle is 20 degrees. Every subsequent projectile has its angle changed by a fixed amount compared to the last. This amount is stored in this parameter. In our case, I've set it to negative 10 degrees, so the second projectile spawns 10 degrees lower than the first, then the third projectile spawns 10 degrees lower than that, and so on. After this, we move on to spawn speed. Similar to the spawn angle, vertical swing groups assign the first projectile a base spawn speed and then change the speed of every subsequent projectile by a certain amount more than the last. The base speed is stored in this parameter and the speed offset is stored in this one. In our case, the base spawn speed is 5 and our offset is negative 0.25. Thus, our first projectile gets a speed of 5, the second gets a speed of 4.75, the third gets a speed of 4.5, and so on. Next, we'll apply the vertical spawn spread. Like horizontal swings with their horizontal spawn spread, the vertical spawn spread is applied both upwards and downwards. It is stored in this parameter, and in our case, I've set it to 1. Unlike the horizontal swings, if only a single projectile is in the group, it'll spawn at the top instead of in the middle of the spread. Lastly, as a player looks up and down while swinging, the spawn positions of the projectiles are rotated around the group's base spawn point, going counterclockwise if the player looks up and clockwise if the player looks down. So, if we look up, our projectiles will move as such. And if we look down, our projectiles will move as such. A bit of a tangent here, but the group spawn position can also change depending on whether the player is looking up or down, but it's not quite straightforward. You see, horizontal and vertical swing groups can set a vertical offset for the group's base spawn point to be at. This offset is stored in this parameter. If the offset is 0, then the group spawn point will be at this red point that's not to scale. I'll just call this a natural base spawn point. As you look down, the natural base spawn point will swing forwards like so, and as you look up, the natural base spawn point will swing backwards like so. When we add a vertical offset to a group, this vertical offset will be applied with respect to the natural base spawn point. As you look down, both the natural spawn point and the group spawn point will move in unison, and the same applies if you look up. Well, technically speaking, these two spawn points can actually have different angles. Explaining why this happens isn't super important, and the example seen here is not even close to how it works in-game. It's much more subtle, like this. but in general, you can just imagine that they move in unison. The way these spawn points move will become important later, so keep this in the back of your mind for now. There's also something that is unique to vertical swings, and it's with how the collision of their projectiles work. So, like all other projectiles, vertical swing projectiles make use of these parameters to determine their collision. I explained how they work in detail in part 1, but to quickly recap, they start out at one size and then expand to another over time, with there being two distinct hitboxes, one that checks for collision with the stage and one that checks for collision with players. While rollers do have the normal collision parameters for their vertical swings, they're a bit deceptive. To explain why, let's simulate a projectile and give it identical stage and player collision parameters for now to simplify. Instead of using the normal spherical hitbox that other weapons use, roller vertical swings can create 5 smaller projectiles arranged like so. 4 surrounding ones, and 1 central one. The size of the surrounding projectiles is determined by multiplying the collision size by a coefficient stored in this parameter, and the size of the central projectile is determined by multiplying the collision size by a coefficient stored in this parameter. You'll notice that the surrounding projectiles are positioned in such a way that they perfectly touch the edges of the original projectile shape. This is done automatically and works even as the projectile expands in size. This unique collision shape allows for something interesting. If one of the surrounding hitboxes collides with a wall, it'll disappear, but leave the other hitboxes intact. That way, the projectile can graze a wall and it won't hit anyone hiding behind it, unlike some other projectiles I'm not going to mention. If the center hitbox collides with a wall though, it'll cause the whole projectile to disappear. Note that this only applies to the wall detection. For player detection, the 5 hitboxes are treated as one, so if one of the surrounding hitboxes hits someone, it'll cause all other hitboxes to disappear. Now if we simulate this with the player and stage collision hitboxes at different sizes, we end up seeing that they create 2 of these formations like so, one for the player hitbox and one for the stage hitbox. The multipliers for the player and stage hitboxes are the same, but since the stage collision hitbox is smaller in our case, the projectiles it creates are naturally smaller too. The stage collision hitboxes are still tied to their player hitbox counterparts though. If we create a wall here, we'll see that one of the player surrounding hitboxes is within the bounds of the wall. However, since its stage collision hitbox isn't within the wall, it'll continue as normal. It's not until we move the wall into the stage collision hitbox that the surrounding hitbox disappears. The same thing is true for the central hitbox. If the wall is just inside the player hitbox but not the stage hitbox, it'll be fine. But if it goes within the central stage hitbox, it'll cause the projectile to disappear. These surrounding hitboxes are attached to the central hitbox in 4 directions perpendicular to the direction the projectile is heading in. You can see what this looks like in practice with this small 3D demo. Okay, now I can talk about damage. There are 3 factors that determine how much damage your projectiles do: distance, time, and angle. Starting with angles, roller horizontal swings have a mechanic where if you hit someone at an angle that's far enough away from the center of your swing, stored in this parameter, you will deal reduced damage. In this visual, the green area is the area with higher damage. I've set the angle to be 15 degrees in this case, and similar to how the horizontal swing projectile spread works, this 15 degrees goes both ways, creating a 30-degree arc. The yellow area here is pretty much just cosmetic. In reality, roller projectiles only care if you're inside or outside of the green area. Everywhere else does reduced damage. But in practice, since roller projectiles have a limit to how far to the sides they can go, it's not a terrible idea to think of them like this. The green area is also widened horizontally out at the bottom like so. The amount that it is widened by is stored in this parameter, and it also extends out in both directions. I've widened it out by 1 unit in each direction in this case. Note that the green area extends upwards infinitely, so it doesn't matter how high above or below your opponent is. As long as they're within this horizontal arc, they'll take the increased damage. This arc also is not tied to the projectiles directly, it's based on where the center of the opponent's hurtbox is. So if I move the example hurtbox here, it'll take the increased damage, since the center is still within the green arc. But if I move it here, it'll take less damage since it's outside of the green arc now. The next factor for damage is distance. There are parameters that define how much damage the roller's projectiles will deal at up to 4 distinct points, defined as the max damage point, high damage point, low damage point, and min damage point. The distance parameters will cause the roller projectiles to deal damage equal to their corresponding value parameters if the projectile hits at that distance. If a projectile hits between 2 distance parameters, the damage will be interpolated between the 2 damage values depending on where it hit between them. For a visual demonstration of how this works, take the Dynamo roller's horizontal swing. Here are the parameters for the inside hitbox. Let's chart these values on a graph. Below 7.2 units, it will deal 180 damage. It then gets its damage reduced down to 100 as it reaches 10.77 units. then down to 50 at 16.49 units, then 40 at 17.4 units. However, keep in mind that these damage values apply to the inside area, which is a fancy way of saying the green area I mentioned earlier. If we get outside of this green area, we use what is called the outside damage values. These outside values are usually way lower than the inside ones that punish you for missing your swing. Here's the parameters for the outside area on the Dynamo roller's horizontal swing. Let's go back and chart this on the graph. Initially, it will deal 120 damage below 0.2 units, then get reduced to 100 damage at 3.38 units, then go down to 50 damage at 9.91 units, then 40 damage at 12.2 units. It's also worth noting that the damage dealt is not based on the distance between the roller user and the opponent. For horizontal and brush swings, it's instead based on the distance from the opponent to the roller group's base spawn point, even if the projectile that hits is spread out from the center. For vertical swings, it's instead simply based on the distance from the opponent to the individual projectile's spawn point. However, there is one small additional rule that applies to both horizontal and vertical swings. If the roller projectile moves away from its spawn point and then gets closer again, which can happen if it is fired upwards then falls down, the damage is instead dealt based on where its furthest point from its group spawn was for horizontal swings and its individual spawn for vertical swings. You can think of it as if the damage dealt by the projectiles can only go down after its spawn and can never go back up again. And on the subject of damage being based on the projectile's spawn point, remember how I mentioned the group spawn points can be moved forwards and backwards? Well, since looking downwards makes your projectile spawn point move forwards a bit, this means that it also increases your damage. This is mainly relevant to vertical swings, and thanks to the fact that the top projectile is sent upwards a little bit normally, it gets neutraled out when you look down a bit. So that's why looking down a bit squeezes a little bit more damage out of your vertical swings. The last piece of the damage puzzle is time, and thankfully this one is pretty simple. If a roller projectile is out for too long, then the game will start to reduce its damage by a factor that increases over time. Keep in mind that this is a multiplier applied to the damage it would normally deal, but it works independently to distance and angle. The damage multiplier starts at 1.0, but once a projectile is out for a certain number of frames defined by this parameter, the damage multiplier will start going down until the projectile is out for a number of frames defined by this parameter, at which point the damage multiplier will be equal to the value stored in this parameter. In other words, the damage of the projectile gets reduced to a certain factor over the course of a specific time window. You're probably wondering what happens when more than one projectile from a swing hits an opponent, and the answer is thankfully simple. If a projectile has already hit an opponent before another one hits, the game compares the damage that the second projectile will do to the first one. If it is greater than the damage that the first projectile did, it overwrites the damage of the first projectile. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. This damage overwrite is the reason why you sometimes hear hit sound multiple times when you swing at an opponent. Note that regardless of whether or not the damage is overwritten by a second projectile, it will always vanish when it hits an opponent. Oh, and there's one last mechanic I need to mention: Depleted Swings. If you don't have enough ink to do a full swing, the game will check to see if you still have more ink than a certain threshold determined by multiplying the normal ink consumption of a swing by a value stored in this parameter. If you do meet this threshold, the game will consume this reduced amount of ink and allow you to do a depleted swing. Depleted swings have far weaker stats than a normal swing. They have their damage reduced, their speed reduced, and the number of projectiles reduced. Here are all the parameters that control these swings. There also seems to be a parameter intended to reduce the collision size of the projectiles, but from my testing, it doesn't work properly. Since depleted swings still consume ink, you can't always use them if you swing while you're low on ink. They seem to be intended to squeeze out a small amount of extra ink in your tank if you have some to spare. And with that out of the way, I can finally move on to the simulations. I've got two major ones this time, being the standard 3D ones alongside a top-down 2D one. The 2D simulation will showcase the effects of randomization on the horizontal swing projectiles alongside a color-coded showcase of the damage points. I'll show the damage points being created one by one alongside the damage that they deal at the top. Note that for horizontal swings, the inner and outer damage areas don't always have the same set of damage numbers, so if that's the case, I'll be putting the outside damage in a parenthesis and the inside damage out of them. In this example for the Splat roller, the orange area does 150 to 100 damage for the inside area, but a clean 100 damage for the outside area. Also, since some rollers and brushes skip over the damage thresholds in their damage values, I'll show you another diagram in those cases with those damage thresholds made more clear. The damage for vertical swings will be shown as well, but remember that since their damage varies with the spawn point of the projectiles, the damage areas can vary a little bit too. Oh, and for the Salmon Run players out there, the damage distances don't change, but the damage numbers do. So you can replace the damage numbers with the relevant Salmon Run damage numbers, and it'll be an accurate damage graph for Salmon Run. The showcase of the projectiles themselves will have the projectiles placed in the location where they hit the ground if they are fired at a 5-degree angle. It's hard to capture the physics of a 3D game in 2D space, but hopefully the simulation proves good enough. The 3D simulations will showcase what the horizontal and vertical swings look like in practice alongside their depleted variants. Rollers use bullet simple params, so they'll be colored green for straight state, red for break state, and yellow for free state. If you don't know what I mean by the bullet simple params, check out part 1 of the series to get an idea of how they work. Since the player and field hitboxes are usually different for rollers, I'll be showing both at the same time. The gray ones are the field hitboxes, and the colored ones are the player hitboxes. Vertical swings will be shown being fired at 2 different angles, a 5-degree angle and a negative 7.5 degree one. 5 degrees is the natural firing angle of rollers, and negative 7.5 degrees is an angle that offsets the upwards angle that the highest projectile goes at. Check the top of the screen to figure out which angle is being used. As always, I will not be showing any of the simulations in slow motion, but you can slow down the video playback in the settings, as well as progress forwards and backwards 1 frame at a time on desktop by pausing and pressing the period and comma keys. Oh, and a little bit of a warning, the 3D simulations may contain flashing lights. I've colored them in a way to try and cut down on the flashing, but if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, you should watch them in slow motion or skip them altogether. Anyways, let's finally move on to the simulations. Splat Roller's horizontal swing has interesting damage values. The inside damage values start at 150 damage, then go down to 100, then jump down to 35, while the outside damage values start at 100, go to 50, then go down to 35. I'll be color coding the 100 to 50 and 50 to 35 damage areas with the same color for the outside damage values. The numbers in parentheses are the damage that the weapon will deal in Salmon Run. Dynamo Roller relies almost entirely on spawn speed RNG to cover large areas with its horizontal swings. As you might expect, that leads to a lot of consistency issues. Carbon Roller vertical swings give over the 100 damage threshold, and since that's a pretty important one, I'll be sure to show it. Flingza roller horizontal swings have the same inside damage numbers as the Splat roller, while the outside damage numbers are worse. However, its projectiles don't go as far. Also, due to a missing parameter, when Flingza does a depleted swing, the outside hitbox does twice as much damage as it's supposed to, dealing more than the inside ones when depleted. Flingza's vertical swings feature some projectiles that go off to the side for some extra paint. These projectiles have the paint only param set to true, which means that they don't deal any damage to players. Here's what they look like in practice. Big Swig Roller horizontal swings feature 3 large groups that make its pain and damage much more consistent than the Dynamo roller. Big Swig Roller is the only roller to fire 6 damaging projectiles in its vertical swings instead of the usual 5. Grizzco Roller pulls some of its parameters directly from the Dynamo roller before pulling from the defaults, so some of the yellow parameters are the ones pulled from Dynamo. Inkbrush's primary two projectiles are spaced out in such a way that they can frequently whiff against opponents on the sides at longer ranges. However, they do consistently hit the center, so with good aim it shouldn't matter as much. Octobrush scales straight from its maximum 40 damage to its minimum 20 damage in a single damage point. Painbrush has 5 total projectile groups and all of them deal damage. This makes it far more consistent than other brushes and rollers. Its projectiles also don't swing left and right as much as the other brushes, which makes sense given its higher range and tighter spread. Painbrush features similar damage scaling to the Octobrush, going from 60 damage to 31 damage in one single interpolation point. And finally, we're at the end. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. This video took quite a while to make, so it really means a lot to me. If there's any part of this video that you found confusing, feel free to ask a question in the comments and I'll try my best to get to all of them. That's all for now, thanks for watching.